So what is exactly the nervous system? Well, it's comprised of two main parts, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Well, the central nervous system is made up of the brain and the spinal cord, but most importantly the brain. And you got the peripheral nervous system, which basically are a set of nerves that connect the brain to the rest of the body. So let's just talk about a quick simple example. Let's just say you get a paper cut, and you decide you're fed up with this sheet of paper and you scrunch it up and throw it into the bin. Well, in this simple example, you've got obviously the paper cut, and you've got some receptor cells in the skin of your fingers that respond to specific stimuli, in this case touch. So your skin acts as a sense organ. So a sense organ is basically a group of receptor cells that respond to specific stimuli. In this case, it's again, as I say, touch, but it can also be things like light, sound, temperature, and chemicals. And you've got some neurons that send the impulses from the sense organ all the way to the brain, and therefore we feel pain. Okay, and from the central nervous system, there's also a different set of neurons that send impulses from the CNS, basically from the brain this time, all the way to what we call an effector. And an effector is basically a set of muscles or glands which respond when they receive impulses from motor neurons. We'll talk more about that in a second, but in this scenario here, your brain tells your arms or your finger muscles or whatever to scrunch up the paper and throw it into the bin. What's important here again is to note that you've got some neurons that specifically carry impulses from the sense organ all the way to the brain, and you've got another set of neurons that deliver or send impulses from the central nervous system, the brain, all the way to your muscles, which is just another example of an effector. And these neurons that connect these things together is all part of the peripheral nervous system, again, which is basically what connects everything to the brain. So let's take a little bit of a more detailed approach to this. From the sensory organs all the way to the brain, you've got something called sensory neurons, which is delivering that information. So as the diagram would suggest, the impulses traveling from the left side here all the way to the right side. In case of a sensory neuron, this is quite important to know the direction of travel of the impulse. And so it starts off from the sensory receptors that gains the impulse and sends it all the way through to what we call a dendron, which is basically a little tube, and it sends it all the way to the end called dendrites, where it relays the information to the brain. You've got the cell body, which is kind of it's got the nucleus of the neuron, and the neuron also has the myelin sheath, which basically helps to keep the impulses inside the dendron and not get lost outside. And how does the sensory neuron compare to the motor neuron? Well, the main difference again is that in a sensory neuron, the dendrites are at the very end of the transmission. But for a motor neuron, the dendrites are what picks up the impulse and sends it all the way through to the end where we have the nerve endings. We've also got the tube here where the impulse gets transmitted, but in a motor neuron we call it the axon, and in a sensory neuron we call it the dendron. It's also got the myelin sheath, so that doesn't change, but the location of the cell body is also different. You've got the cell body, which is sort of midway, or at least not at the ends of the neurons for the sensory neuron, but for a motor neuron, the cell body is always at the end where the dendrites are. So technically, it's not at the end. Actually, it's at the front part, because this is where the impulse starts. Again, as I said, the brain sends the impulses directly to the dendrites here. Where for in case of a motor neuron, it's got the cell body, and the line of transmission is going from right to left in this case. So it goes from left to right here and right to left here. So it's quite important to understand the structure and be familiar with the terms and how to label these diagrams. So, in some cases, well, let's talk about this. In majority of the cases, when we feel something, our brain processes the information and then it tells us what to do. For example, in the example of the paper cut, we've got the paper cut. Our brain processes the information and decides to tell our arms and muscles to scrunch up the paper and throw it into the bin. And majority of life situations are like that. However, there are some situations where we don't want the brain to it's not that we don't want the brain to process this, but we can't wait for the brain to process it, because that would take too much time. For example, imagine you touch a really hot pan. If we waited for your brain to process the information, by the time it does that and signals our arms to take or our fingers to take our hands off the pan, we would have been already burnt. Okay, so that's quite ineffective. So in situations like that, our body is quite smart and uses a simple reflex arc. Okay, so what that does is, in this example here, you've got a little pin on the ground, and this is your foot, and you accidentally step on the pin, for example. So under normal circumstances, this would get transferred to the brain, and the brain would tell your foot to take your foot off the pin, basically. But because that takes too long, what we have here is a reflex arc where you've got the sensory neuron taking information from the sensory organ, which is the skin of the foot, to the spinal cord, and instead of that message going to the brain and waiting for the brain to give out an order, it gets directly relayed to a motor neuron connected by a relay neuron, and therefore the muscles in your toes automatically take your foot off the pin. Okay, and again, the message does get delivered to the brain at some point, obviously, but the action happens even before the brain sends out an order for it to do so, for obvious reasons, obviously, because again, it saves us time, and it's just basically, you could call it a survival instinct. Okay, so this is what we call a reflex action. So this you need to be able to draw this simple reflex arc. Just understand that there are three components. Obviously, you've got the sensory neurons, and the sensory neurons get connected to a relay neuron, which then get connected to a motor neuron, and all these connections happen within the spinal cord. Okay, so let's just take a quick look at these connection points between the neurons. You see how there's a little gap that is represented in such diagrams. Now let's take a deeper look at how neurons connect from one neuron to the other, and how the transmission of impulses actually happen between these neurons. So what actually happens is that we've got a synapse here. So synapse is basically the connection points between one neuron to the other. So this first little structure here, that's the first neuron, and the second structure is the second neuron. And we'll take a look at how an impulse travels from this first neuron to the second neuron, and you can immediately tell that they're not physically connected. So what happens here is that as the impulse comes down from the first neuron, it actually triggers these little vesicles to move towards the edge of the neuron, and these vesicles contain what we call neurotransmitters. So as they sort of connect and fuse with the membrane on the edge, it vomits out basically all these neurotransmitters that were kept inside these vesicles, and they get put out into the synaptic cleft, which is just basically a fancy word to describe the gap between the two neurons. And so the receptors, the vesicles which contain the neurotransmitters fuse, the neurotransmitters get sent out and diffuse across to the other neuron, where they've got specific receptors that bind to these neurotransmitters, and therefore it triggers a series of reactions which carry the impulse, continue the impulse from the first neuron to the second neuron as a result of these interactions. So what's important here is that the direction of impulses is unidirectional. So the impulse can only be delivered from the neuron that has these neurotransmitters, and only to a neuron that has specific receptors. So in this scenario, you've got the neuron from the top transferring impulses to the bottom. You cannot transmit impulses from the bottom neuron to the top neuron, because the bottom neuron does not have any neurotransmitter transmitter vesicles or the neurotransmitters themselves. So it can only, what this structure allows is that the impulses can only travel in one direction, and this is specifically useful in, for example, in reflex arc, where you don't want information traveling in opposite directions. You want the information only traveling in one direction, and how the synapse is laid out allows that to happen.